So on Tuesday of last week, because apparently releasing my videos on Wednesday is the absolute worst thing for MTG related announcements, MTG unveiled the beta for their new bracket system for Commander, which is essentially a matchmaking tool designed to give people a simple way to describe both what kind of deck they have and, in turn, what kind of deck they want to play against. I know that sounds like a weird explanation to those of you that don't play MTG or potentially just don't play Commander, but I feel like explaining what the system is does a lot more to explain what it does than any sort of summary at the beginning. And I also feel that in that description comes my own thoughts on it because, well, I do have them. So there are 5 brackets, and what I'm going to do is start with bracket 1, which is the most restrictive and lowest power level, to talk about here being designated as below the level of precons and describe how each restriction from 1 change as we go up brackets, and in turn talk about what I feel about those restrictions. So let's start with the most universal one. No mass land denial, which Wizards helpfully defined when the whole thing was revealed as anything that negatively impacts 4 or more lands per player without replacing them, which is generally considered one of the least fun ways to play Magic. I don't even say for a lot of people there, it's one of the few cases where I would say it's objectively unfun. More limited land destruction is something that's still allowed, and while the ideas behind land destruction in Commander are something that would not only be another video, but also something I feel like has been done to death by a bunch of other people, the general idea is that there's a difference between denying people the ability to play the game and targeting a particular piece on an opponent's board that happens to be in the land slot that's making them almost impossible to deal with. This particular restriction goes all the way through the brackets that actually have restrictions on them, which is something I'll talk about in the end. Next restriction is in relation to a mechanic that's also considered unfun, although admittedly with the caveat that it seems like it should be very fun for the player who's actually using it. In bracket 1, no extra turn cards are allowed. Taking an extra turn in Commander tends to be a pretty good way to close out a game that is about to end, but part of the hatred for this actually comes from what the bracket 2 restriction addresses. No chaining extra turns. Basically, taking an extra turn once is fine. In that case, you really do want to do it only when it's going to have a huge impact. But there are decks that exist that are built on taking a ton of extra turns at once and locking the rest of the table out of the game by making it so that you're the only one that gets to go. I've made a deck that wound up doing this a lot, and personally wound up feeling like it wasn't very fun as a deck to actually play, even if it was a fun goldfishing deck. So again, this is a very reasonable ban, and having the super low power level just say no extra turns at all is totally valid. I'm actually going to skip down my list for a second and go to one of the restrictions that has no bearing beyond bracket 2, and that's the restriction on tutors, namely that you should only have a few. Tutors are a term for anything that searches your deck for a card that can hit something other than a land. And although Wizards didn't clarify what few means, Moxfield actually has a filter for how to do brackets when you make a deck on Moxfield, and they seem to define few as 3. So that's what I'm going to go with for now. To be honest, I feel like Wizards could have actually defined this better. I'll get into another aspect of what they could have done in terms of definitions later, but the long and the short of it is that I think this restriction in particular could use with the hard numbers that another restriction that we'll talk about later was given. But I do understand what they're getting at. Something that makes Commander exciting as a casual format is that a 100 card deck where most cards are limited to 1 makes games a lot more variable, and searching your deck frequently serves to homogenize a deck's play pattern, which, while probably good for a competitive game or game mode, is far less so for casual chaotic fun, and that's basically why the restriction goes on lower power levels. I'd argue that given how similar brackets 1 and 2 really are, you could have restricted this even further, but I'll get there when I talk about that other thing that I've hinted at. But first, I need to talk about infinite combos. Now, the list doesn't bother restricting infinites that work with 3 or more cards, but instead just on the 2-card infinite combos, which I presume is primarily the ones that actually do something to progress you towards winning with just those 2 cards, and not something that needs a different engine in order to take advantage of going infinite. Again, makes a lot of sense. A 2-card infinite is just a win con out of nowhere most of the time, so the first 2 brackets saying no to them whatsoever is fine. Bracket 3 so that you can do 2-card infinites if they're in the late game, defined by Wizards as around turn 7 or 8, and it's easy to presume that has to be when you can play both pieces, but at the same time that applies to almost every infinite combo, so I'm not sure. I guess it depends on how protectable the combo is as well. Just need a more succinct definition, which is an aspect of all this I'll touch on more in a few moments because it's pretty relevant to the whole thing. So now let's talk about a term called game changers. This is a list of currently 40 cards that are in essence indicators of high power level. I'll put the list on screen right now, and to be honest, I'm not really going to make the contents of the list a big part of this video, because any thoughts I could have on it are a whole different thing. But the main way I want to talk about is what this list means in the context of brackets. It's a form of restricted list, basically. Bracket 1 and 2 decks should have no game changers, and bracket 3 decks can have up to 3 of them. Thus, probably where the tutor number defining few comes from in Moxfield. It's basically cards that can frustrate players and are very powerful. And to be honest, I like the idea of this, if not necessarily the execution, which really goes into the brackets I have not been mentioning this whole time. So, brackets 4 and 5, right? I haven't brought up their restrictions, and that's because those restrictions don't exist. The only restriction relevant to these is the ban list. So, why are there 2 brackets with no extra restrictions? Simple. One is simply for decks that are highly optimized, and the other is for highly optimized decks that are made for competitive play. This is the dumbest designation that I've ever seen, and makes Bracket 5 feel like it was tacked on to make CDH feel like it's present too. It's borderline insulting. It also makes the gulf between 3 and 4 gigantic, while making 4 and 5 borderline non-existent in difference. Seriously, early game infinite combos aren't normally used in regular Commander anyway, and mass land denial is still frowned upon regardless, so really you could have just made bracket 5 unrestricted, made bracket 4 have very few restrictions. And that's removing the fact that you have an enumerated aspect to the rules right there to use. And while they say part of the goal of this is simplicity, that kind of flies in the face of what 4 and 5 do as well. I mean, think about it for a second. The difference between them is in no way mechanical. Your bracket 5 deck can be a bracket 4 deck if you really want it to be. It's based entirely on mindset. And while you can, in theory, make a bracket 2 or 3 deck designed to be relevant in bracket 4 games if you have the mindset to do so, it complicates the process of a Rule Zero conversation that is supposed to be simplifying, when the only difference in place is that Rule Zero conversation in and of itself. And even simply allowing bracket 4 more game changers and bracket 5 all of the game changers would create at least somewhat of a mechanical difference. I'd argue that differentiating them mechanically could also be very interesting, and denoting differences in mindset with a letter in addition to the number could actually make CEDH more open to lower power level and potentially entry level if you really want to go there, modes of play. Like, I'm sorry, but the idea of bracket 3 CEDH, where you have this Canadian Highlander rule of certain cards being restricted and used together, or even bracket 2 CEDH, where the ban list is expanded, could be very interesting to play, even as a niche thing. And having Wizards officially endorse it would expand the niche quite a lot to give people varied experiences, which is good for the long-term health of the game. When looking at the bracket system, I have to compare it to what already existed for the Rule Zero conversation, and that is the 1 to 10 power level system that really had its own flaws because everything about it was based on feeling and didn't have many objective measures that were codified properly. This is kind of what leads to the whole every deck is a 7 problem, where it's very easy to misrate your deck, or feel like someone's deck is more powerful than it is because of a lucky draw. Creating an objective set of rules around that kind of thing serves to help prevent people from mislabeling their deck's power level on purpose, which does happen. It's not outright preventative, mind you, but it provides an objective measure for someone who has lied about their deck's power level, because otherwise the only defense is whether or not you believe them when they say they didn't realize their Crom and Timna deck was super broken actually after they demonic consultation into Thassa's Oracle for the win. CEDH was generally agreed upon, though, to be power levels 9 and 10, but the key is there were cards that did point your deck being towards those power levels, even if it wasn't a hard line. Different cards tend to be played when you're in CDH, which is part of why I think the letter code designation for something like CDH works better. You can have the tier where anything goes, but the Rule Zero conversation changes about what kind of game you want to have. That can change if you're running the deck built around your game-winning combo that you put a ton of resources in protecting, or if you just want to play a pod with Urza, Yuriko, Grand Arbiter, and Winota for everyone else to just do degenerate things all the time, but still have plenty of high power level stuff below that. The idea of having multiple lists in relation to game changers actually did come up when they were talking about this, which actually makes a lot of sense to me. Designate what counts as a tutor more specifically. Why the hell does my Wishclaw Talisman count the same as Diabolic Tutor when it comes to my deck's power level? For that matter, why do things that search for specific card types or even named cards count the same as something that can search for anything at around the same cost in that regard? Granted, I think in this case it would be better to have it function as a white list of tutors that don't count against you rather than a black list of ones that do, and that creates a lot more complexity than necessary. This definitely should apply, though, to the form of 2-card infinites that we know what should count on a more objective level. And let's be real, Yuriko is not a game changer when she's not in the command zone, so having cards that are game changers in the command zone but not in the main deck could also be a helpful thing. This is also me getting why they wouldn't do any of this stuff, though, and that comes back to the complexity thing, and introducing it in a lot more simple of a form is probably a good thing. But I do think that they should do some of this, perhaps, and Commander's big enough where having multiple lists in this style is very much warranted. But what do you guys think? Does this seem sufficient to you, or are you looking for more from this system than what they provided so far? And what do you think about the game changers? Anything you want removed? Anything you want added to it? Cards coming off the ban list are probably going to land here. What cards do you think should come off the ban list and onto the game changers list? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like on your way out. Until next time, this is the effing Boonslayer signing out.